Joe, Ani, Waubgeshig Rice, Wasauksing. Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, Janet. Hi, Cherie. Hi, Nancy, and everybody else joining online. This is really, really cool to be a part of this. I just want to say, before anything else, I'm greatly honored that Hamilton Reed selected Moon of the Crusted Snow this year. It's been an awesome program to be involved with. I really appreciated the attention the book's received and just, you know, the many hands and eyes it's passed through. You know, there's no greater honor really as an author than to have your book shared in a community specifically, and having everyday community members just read it and talk about it. You know, it's super cool. And it is a huge honor for me to be part of this event with Janet and Cherie, two people who have really widened the circle for people like me. And I've looked up to both of you for a long time, and I'm just really pleased and really honored to be chatting with you today.
And in our storytelling, as we know as Indigenous writers, there's always a great responsibility that we write from, knowing that, you know, we're not only representing ourselves as authors, but we represent a whole community of people. And then beyond that, a whole nation of people in terms of, you know, what we're producing then becomes the future culture of what we represent. And so I'm wondering, because you both work in this futuristic, this kind of speculative canon of writing, and you're creating new worlds essentially. Do you still think about that responsibility as you're creating new worlds with your speculative writing?
So yeah, I don't take it lightly at all, and I think that, you know, I only share what is appropriate and what I guess I'm allowed to, for lack of a better word, in the written word, right? Because we're sort of, we're jumping across mediums, right? By going from the oral tradition to literary styles, I guess you could say. So yeah, so by imagining, I guess, a future in that sense, you know, I go back to how stories were shared with me, and I think about what will carry us through and how we can sort of frame those realities in the written word in order to, I guess, convey that spirit initially, I guess you could say, right? So, but it is, yeah, you know, we talk about it a lot, is the responsibility, the accountability you have to your home community and to your home people. And, you know, if you mess up, they're the ones who are going to tell you right away. You know, they're going to be the first to tell you that you maybe shouldn't have shared that, or maybe that's something that we keep, that's something we speak amongst ourselves, or that's something that stays in our community, kind of thing. So yeah, it's just about being embedded in that culture and just being guided by that spirit.
Absolutely. I had a very similar response. I think back to when a review of mine was coming out in the New York Times, and people, you know, were really excited, and they're like, "My God, are you nervous? How's it going? Like, this is big." And I could answer from a place of complete honesty that, I mean, yes, it was very exciting, but I was nowhere as nervous as when I handed over, you know, my story to the community, like to people in my community. That was nerve-wracking, because if you get it wrong, like you said, Janet, and I love that you brought that up, what we do now really influences what the culture will be, how it will evolve. You know, tradition is a living thing. It changes and it moves forward, and we're responsible for sort of crafting the vessels now and how that's going to be transmitted or not. So I think that's really important. I remember, you know, we're so lucky in this generation of writers, because we have so many of our heroes still with us, so many pioneering voices. And then this beautiful upswell of these just genius young writers and new writers, not necessarily young, but new writers coming out all at the same time. And so I, you know, had the privilege of, when I was starting out, spending a lot of time with people like Lee Maracle and Maria Campbell. And I remember both of them in different ways saying the same thing to me when I had those questions about, how do I know, you know, if I can tell these stories? Am I the person to tell this story? And when you're telling stories amongst us, I mean, you can decide who's going to hear those stories, and it has a life that you can guide because you're in the room. But when you put it on the page, I mean, it's out there, and it's in its own form. And, you know, should we read this story at this time of year? Is this the right lesson at this time? And you know, those women, those writers, those mentors said to me essentially this, that when you're writing and people are reading your work, it's almost like they're overhearing a conversation, right? So us as Indigenous people, we're having a conversation, and there are a bunch of people sort of listening in and hearing pieces of it. And so they said, you need to remember two things. One, first and foremost, this is a conversation between us. So that is your priority. And second of all, you need to be confident in what you're writing, and you need to speak clearly so that when people hear it, it's not broken telephone, that they hear what it is that you meant to say, but that conversation is ours. So I always carry that forward and try and remember, this is, a wider audience is brilliant. It's great career-wise, and it's great for the community. I love that, kids in schools are learning from our books and our stories, their books and their stories. But that first conversation is always primarily, it's between us. And so I always remember that. It's why, and I know Waubgeshig and Janet, you both do this in your work. There are times you don't translate things, right? Like we use our languages, we use our understandings, and it's not translated, and it's not othered, it's not italicized. This is the primary lesson of the book. This is the primary language of the book. Anything else is sort of extra. So it is a huge responsibility, but God, it's such a privilege and honor too, right? I can't imagine. It's tough sometimes. You guys know, sitting on those panels and answering questions that other writers don't have to answer, right? Someone's asking another, non-Indigenous writer about character and plot, and they're asking you about genocide and pipelines, and you're like, oh my God, why is this so hard? Yeah. But also, man, I wouldn't give it up for anything. I can't imagine, not being from the places that we're from, those places of absolute story.
Understand the power and importance of the land, because that's the most reliable. That's where our life is. And, despite everything that happens around us, the land has always been there for us, right? And everything that we're inhabiting right now could collapse anytime, but the land has all the food and all the medicine and everything that can sustain us, right? So I guess if I was to pick one for Moon of the Crusted Snow, that's sort of what I would hope people would take away from it, for sure.
Nice.
So what I took away from Moon of the Crusted Snow, I know that's not the question, but I want to say this because I love this book. For me, it was, and there's just been this discussion. I know, we've all been involved in as a literary community. Well, I think maybe we've sort of been watching it happen because it's a strange discussion, but I get it. I get where it's coming from, where people are saying, do we want to read hard literature right now? Do we want to read, apocalyptic or dark literature right now? Because, the world is very dystopian and dark, especially right now with the pandemic, and God knows what's happening in the States. And, do we want to read light stuff? And for me, books like Moon of the Crusted Snow, which talk about, the end of the world and an apocalypse and a dystopian. Oh God, I was so hopeful. I finished that book and I felt, honestly, like I'm not a big woman, this way. I'm like 5'2", but I felt like 6 friggin' feet tall. I felt like a Cree almost, just like giant. Because I was like, oh man, we got it. We're good. Like we have each other. And when I say survival, and this is what I love about Moon of the Crusted Snow, is we're not talking about survival as in today I can eat. We're talking about survival as in today I can name this food in my language. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. And I totally agree with that. And that element of us, already having endured an apocalypse and this, present civilization that's around us being a dystopia, because it very much is. You ask any of our ancestors, just going back to like our grandparents' generation or the ones before that, yeah, they would definitely call where we live now a dystopia. This, the world ended when they were younger, and this has been created around them, and it's everything that their cultures aren't in it, right? So yeah, I think it's very natural for us to dip into that world because it's such a common lived experience, But in terms of like some of the other elements of sci-fi and fantasy, to answer your question, Janet, yeah, I definitely believe that we have those in our stories to begin with. And if you just take like, in the Anishinaabe culture, we have the Nanabush stories, right? He's the trickster figure who, is responsible for creating a lot of the things in our world. Like he goes out and he talks to the bears and he talks to the bees, and he lives in that world, and that would widely be considered, I guess, fantasy, by contemporary literary standards, I guess, right? But those are the stories we grew up with, and that's how we learn how certain things came to be. So in that sense, like, I really see taking Indigenous stories, like traditional Indigenous stories, and putting them into the literary format as kind of an adaptation, I guess. It's like taking like a cube, a 3D cube, and putting it down on a piece of paper as like 6 squares, because the way these stories live is just, they're intangible in some ways, but they're all around us, right? Like the spirits of these stories are around us, and we have to sort of channel them into this like written word and in a colonizer's language at the same time too, So yeah, in some ways it's translating, and in some ways it's adapting.
Right.
I do definitely see parallels between some elements of the book and what we're going through now. But it gets back to what I think Cherie was talking about earlier, is the hope. I think right now it seems weird to gravitate towards post-apocalyptic or dystopian fiction at a time when the world is ending. Like, we're never going back to that world we had in January and February, right? Like, that's gone forever. But I think people see a bit of a hope in a book like Moon of the Crusted Snow or the Marrow Thieves, because there is that spirit of having survived that already and creating a future, getting a bunch of people together to create a community to look beyond, the ending that we're currently experiencing, right? So, and yeah, there's a resolution to those stories too. And I think people right now in the pandemic want a resolution. They want this to be over and something else to start, right? So I feel so fortunate that I'm able to carry on this story. I mean, I never imagined that I would when I wrote the first one. And I didn't imagine that I'd be quitting my job as a journalist to be able to write the next book, So it's, I'm just very grateful, for all readers and all supporters, and obviously programs like Hamilton Reads, definitely.